Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Lippman, and I am one of the co-founders of SunX, the Strong Universal Network, a testimony to someone who was a friend of many, many people in this room tonight, Maurice Strong, and someone who could have been at the UN this week telling people what he told them 50 years ago about the importance of addressing climate change. I'd like to ask Felix Dodd to come up here. He's another co-founder. Felix is a perfect example of what Maurice Strong represented. We met, I think, in 1999 at the Sustainable Development Commission of the UN.
We did, yeah.
Felix was representing the NGOs, and I was representing the industry side. I had your job, Gloria, in those days as president of the World Travel and Tourism Council. And we were supposed to fight, and through Maurice Strong we became firm friends, and we've, together with other people who you will meet and hear about tonight, we've decided to create this lasting legacy to Maurice Strong. I think we're now going to start now with a video of Maurice back in 1972. And I think this will give you a flavor of what it means. After we've had this video, I'm going to ask Hannah Strong to come up here, and she probably knew Maurice better than anybody, and she's going to tell us a few things about living with Maurice Strong.
Sounds like a TV series.
Yes. You're not supposed to speak till afterwards. It's okay. I want to tell you two stories before we start the video, and this is, for me, typical of Maurice. The first one concerns a snail walking up a tree, and he gets halfway up and he meets a woodpecker. And the woodpecker says, "Where are you going, snail?" And the snail says, "I'm going to eat the green leaves." And the woodpecker says, "I don't see any green leaves." And the snail says, "They'll be there by the time I get up there." Maurice Strong had enormous long-term vision. And the second story concerns the same snail, and he's walking down a street. You like these kind of stories?
I do, I love them, yeah.
And he walks down the street, and he gets mugged by a gang of tortoises. And afterwards, the police come along, and they say, "Could you kind of describe what happened?" And the snail says, "I don't know, it all happened so quickly." That's the challenge of climate change. Maurice Strong saw that. And I think it was this capacity, three things really, I would say, Felix. One was the capacity to think long-term, decades ahead of other people. Secondly, to see how these loops would create things to happen faster than anybody could even account for. And thirdly, a vision of building institutions. Many of the institutions, and I think you'll have that feeling after this evening, many of the institutions which are now helping us fight climate change, Maurice Strong was the force behind them.
With all the evidence that we've amassed in our preparations for the Stockholm Conference, including the views of many of the world's leading scientists, I am convinced that the prophets of doom have got to be taken seriously. In other words, doomsday is a possibility. I'm equally convinced that doomsday is not inevitable.
Why do you think they have to be taken seriously?
Well, they have to be taken seriously because it has become apparent that today man's own activities have reached the scale where they are the principal determinants of his own future. For example, we are now today effecting more changes in the composition of the atmosphere, in the composition of the waters of the world, and even the composition of certain elements in our food chain. We're making more of these changes in one generation that have been made in millions of years of human evolution. We don't know exactly what will be the ultimate impact of these changes, but we do know that many of them are irreversible and many of them could be decisive in their effects on man's future. This question is not a matter of one man or one group of people's predictions. It's a matter of the fact that an increasing number of very serious-minded scientists have produced evidence from a whole series of events, many of them the well-known pollution or environmental problems that have come to our attention, that the natural world in which man lives and on which he depends is indeed deteriorating, is being destroyed in many instances at a rate that is accelerating and that can only continue to accelerate unless we begin to control the activities that are having this destructive impact. Now, whether we are pessimistic or optimistic depends really on what we think about the nature of man. Whether we really believe that man, in light of this evidence, is going to be wise enough and enlightened enough to subject himself to this kind of discipline and control.
The film Zero Population Growth predicts a society in the next century where there is overpopulation, where there is extreme pollution, and where people can no longer be allowed to have babies. Now, is this the shape of things to come?
Well, I haven't seen the film, but I can say that if we continue on our present trends, on our present course, it's very likely that in many parts of the world this will be the case. In fact, we have begun to see it in many areas. Now, licenses to have babies, something that I got in trouble for some years ago for suggesting, even in Canada, that this might be necessary at some point, or at least some restriction on the right to have a child. I'm not proposing this. I was simply predicting this as one of the possible courses that society would have to seriously consider should we get ourselves into this kind of situation. But I think the promising thing in this is that it isn't necessary to get ourselves into this situation.
How do we avoid it?
We can avoid it, I think, first of all, by doing what we're now doing, and that is discussing it, understanding that the problem does exist, that the possibility does exist, and in the actions which I believe still are open to us if we take those actions in time. I'm persuaded that the future of man is going to be decided very much by the decisions taken in this generation. And we have to realize it took mankind something like 50 millennia to achieve its first billion of population on this earth. Now it takes us some 20 years to add 1 billion people. Now, this has got to be regarded as a serious problem.
Dr. Strong, there is a cynical view that any United Nations conference must be a talking shop at which a lot is said and very little is done. How do you answer that?
Well, I can only say that I understand that cynicism. It was one of the things that I had to consider when I took on this responsibility. But it is true. Rhetoric and very little follow-up. And right from the beginning, however, we have been determined, because the fact that action in this field is absolutely indispensable to man's future, that governments at Stockholm would be given the maximum opportunity to take decisions which will lead to action. Now, equally, however, I believe that the nations of the world themselves are impressed with the evidence that we have amassed that suggests that we must adopt a much more cooperative attitude towards our dealing with this problem, that Stockholm must usher in a new era of international cooperation. And I believe that this will be the dominant motivation. I have to hope that. Governments have had a long time to prepare themselves. They've been deeply involved in the preparations. They have before them a series of concrete proposals, which they have had now in their hands for about 3 months. Certainly ample time to consider them. There is no basis for avoiding these decisions at Stockholm. And I believe with that the governments will go to Stockholm with an overriding sense of the importance of achieving consensus on at least a large percentage of these proposals.
So it was like living with a hurricane. He was on the move. And what can I say? He was brilliant. He had a vision that he had from when he was a very small child in a very poor community, grew up very poor. And during the Depression, and he made up his mind when he was this big that he would always look after the poorest of the poor. That was his mission. And then later, after 2 years with the Inuit, where he learned fluent Inuit, lived in an igloo, and really got in touch with nature. And this is where he got his environmental training, was from the Inuits. Anyway, he had a fantastic sense of humor. He had a repertoire of thousands of jokes for every occasion. He loved to make people laugh. He loved, obviously, to travel. In Rio, when he did the Rio conference, on the last night, we go out to a small little restaurant outside of Rio to escape the press and so on. And we're sitting there, and of course there happened to be one journalist. So she comes over to the table, and she said, "Mr. Strong, you have 124 heads of state here." Or she said, "How many heads of state?" And he said, "Well, 124 presidents, prime ministers, kings, and so on, but no leaders." Anyway, he had a great sense of humor, and of course that hit the papers. And he had, at that point, he had a table made, a table for 125 people in a great hall, one chair for each of the leaders and a chair for himself. No leader was allowed to bring in any, secretaries, attendants. It was him and 124 world leaders around this table, and he had 1 hour to tell them what was going on with planet Earth. Only one leader went back and really implemented, Agenda 21 that came out of Rio, which was Castro. And, during the meetings, each world leader got 7 minutes to speak. And everybody was so worried that Castro would go on and on and on. So anyway, when Castro walked up to the podium, he went like this. 5. And in 5 minutes, he gave the most brilliant speech I've ever heard. And even Bush was clapping. And when the cameras, so when the cameras, tapped into Bush clapping for Castro, he went like that. Anyway, so another, I think, really great event that he organized. He was Undersecretary General of the UN 8-9 times, but mainly for the environment, science and technology, reform, and so on. But this one was the drought in Ethiopia. 2 million people had died already, and 200 million people were on the line. Nothing was left, no seats, they had sold their tools, there was nothing left. So he calls together all the donor governments in Geneva, and in 1 week, he raised $5 billion and started shipping food in from every corner of the planet and actually kept 200 million people alive. And, you know, climate change. Since 1968, when MIT had the first meeting on climate change, and then there was one in Mexico, Cocoyoc.
At that time?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, the very early climate change meeting was in Mexico. And then, of course, you know, Stockholm. So, but anyway, he had such a vision. And now, I mean, it's like it took a 16-year-old to get the world to listen. I mean, he tried and tried and tried to get him to listen. And of course, the right wing was after him day and night. The whole Murdoch empire had a machine trying to demolish him. So he had a lot of battles in his life. It wasn't all easy. Anyway, short and sweet. And thank you again for being here. And climate change, after 50-some years, have finally arrived and being listened to. It's a little late in the game, but better late than never.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I now have the pleasure of introducing the President and Chief Executive of the World Travel and Tourism Council. More importantly, I'd like to say my friend, Gloria Guevara, who is a former Minister of Tourism in Mexico under the government of President Calderon, and who together were instrumental in putting travel and tourism on the agenda of the G20. And I had the pleasure of attending your event this afternoon, and I thought you might like to say a few words about that to the people here. And I just want to say, as a former president of the World Travel and Tourism Council, how pleased I am to see the re-emergence, the resurgence of the Council under your leadership and your determined intention to take such a strong position on climate change. Gloria Guevara.
Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me okay? That's good. It's working. Thank you, Jeffrey, for the invitation. What an honor and a pleasure to be here. Wonderful to be part of this important event and this important dinner. And we also have some of our members here attending from WTTC as well. World Travel and Tourism Council represents the private sector for travel and tourism globally. And for 30 years, we have also done a lot of research, and that's how we know that we contribute to 10.4% of the global GDP and 1 in 10 jobs. 185 countries around the world we have measured for these 30 years. And the reason why in New York this week, as Jeffrey mentioned, is just to announce our commitment, because for us it's a very important initiative, the sustainable growth. And climate is at the top of the agenda. We partnered with UNFCCC, Patricia Espinosa, another Mexican great friend. As you know, she unfortunately couldn't join us tonight because she had to go to another event that the secretary was double booked, unfortunately, and she had to cover for him. but she sends her greetings, and we signed with her a common agenda last year, the UNFCCC and WTTC, and since then we have been working together. We also partnered with Jeffrey Liebman and his organization, Cenex, to help us with the report. This afternoon, with all of our leaders, we announced that we are targeting to be climate neutral by 2050. And we also define a path to implement and work on scientific targets and also in specific actions that we want to complete. On Sunday, we also signed an agreement with UNEP as well, because it's not only climate, but also the environment. We care about both, as you can imagine. In our sector, we care about food waste, all the management, the water, the plastic, and of course, the energy and all of the above. You will see or hear probably in the news tomorrow the details of our initiatives, what we call OSCARs, and the O, it has to do with zero, climate neutral by 2050. And then in every letter, there are some specific actions. We believe that there's an opportunity to do a lot of sharing of best practices, to measure the impact, also to create a center of collaboration, and to bring the entire sector and to move faster towards climate neutral, as I mentioned before. So for us, it's a top of the agenda. It's an important priority, not only because of travel and tourism depends on natural resources and natural assets. We care about those resources, but because it's the future for sustainable tourism. We understand that. We have some leaders here from our members that they have done the work already, and I'm sure that they'll be sharing their experience with some of you during the dinner. So we're quite excited to be in this dinner, and thank you for the invitation, Jeffrey, and thank you for having us and hosting it here. Now, I would like now to introduce a good friend who, as I have to say, all my life I was in the private sector, and I had the honor to be invited to be part of his cabinet in Mexico, a country that cares a lot about tourism. But during my time in the government, not only I had the chance to see that he made tourism a top priority. Our country, when you count direct, indirect, and induced, depends on 17% of the GDP for travel and tourism. But what was fascinating is to see the leader, as Jeffrey mentioned, that we call him a green president, because he makes sure that every member of the cabinet had climate and had the environment with the specific goals and targets to take care in every single part of the administration. So it's top of the agenda. Sometimes there is a conflict, as you can imagine, but for him there is no challenge and it was no conflict. Climate was top of the agenda, and that's why when he left the government, he was invited to be the chair of the new climate economy, and he's the spokesperson for climate and all of our initiatives. President Calderon, thank you for joining us as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gloria, for your words, and thank you, Jeffrey, for your invitation. Thank you, all of you, for being very patient before the main dish the main ladies serve. So I will try to be very brief, but I never can, but anyway. Well, let me talk about my own feelings today. I got trapped about this nostalgic environment related with the Explorer Club. All the photographs and the beer there, and oh my God. So it's like it's last century, or maybe 2 centuries ago. So it's some kind of powerful magic here that is trapping me, capturing me, and keeping me in the past. And maybe that is what was happening for a lot of people trying to rescuing the first research statements related with climate change. Actually, it takes me to what I learned. In 1972, I was like at 9 years old. But however, my father was already talking about acid rain, melting poles, things like that. Actually, my father was suffering some kind of circulatory disease. And his best friends, the first time he spoke publicly about all this stuff related with climate change, even his best friends started to say, oh my God, poor Luis, no? He's getting very sick. He's getting crazy about his circulatory diseases. So, poor guy. But I remember very well that from the 70s, I listened from him, who I admire very much, all the things was going to happen to the world. And since then, I got a commitment to fight and to work for the future. And actually, it takes me to the comment I want to talk with you. Don't allow yourself to get trapped about the past. Don't allow yourself to get trapped about nostalgia. Actually, it doesn't work very much. You can see this building and the pictures. It doesn't represent the future as the way it used to represent in the last or two last centuries. So what I encourage all of you is we need to redesign the rhetoric, the narrative about the world. We are not exploring the world as it used to be 2 centuries ago. We are trying to rescue the planet and try to bring it to the new generations in a different way, in a better one. We are all, I suppose, or some of us, very excited about the speeches of this young lady of 16 years old, Greta. There is a huge controversy about if she was overreacting or not, or whatever. Oh my God, come on, it's 16 years old. But what is clear is we need to switch our narrative about the world and climate change and environmental problems. We need to switch from talking about the past and what we got in the past and what we were looking in the past for, and start to talk about the future we are wanting for the new generations. We need to talk loudly about how it's going to be the world we are looking for. And that future will be promising. It's promising. It's exactly a world in which any human being will fit. That's the kind of world we are looking for. And the narrative is about the future, not about the past. The narrative is about hope, not about fears. In my own experience, very few people can change their own behavior upon fears. We are insisting to provoke fears in the people. Fears about reality. Yes, we are right. Climate change is going to destroy our civilization sooner or later. But people don't move by themselves upon the feeling of fears. It is better to talk about hope. I wonder how radical we need to be in order to mobilize millions, hundreds or thousands of million people in the world. I believe instead that being radical is not mobilizing too many people, too much people. So being radical, we need to be very persuasive. And the only way to do that is talking about the future and talking about the hope, mobilizing hope of the people. So my message tonight is, let's think about what were the motives that mobilized these brilliant, extraordinary people that belong to this Explorer Club in New York. They were looking for some kind of future. They have some kind of honest curiosity about the future, about the reality, about the civilization. So we need to have the very same curiosity about our own civilization. And that won't be in the very far North Pole, which is not far anymore. Actually, it's not going to be there anymore. Our future will be in the kind of civilization we will be able to build. And we will be able to persuade decision makers and politicians and businessmen if we are able to describe the kind of future the humankind needs. And we can do that. We definitely can do that. We are late on that, definitely. I'm trying to avoid my own skeptical feelings about the future, but in any case, we are building and we are scaling up the probabilities to have a better future. And I believe we are going to be even able to see it, not only to build it. So, switch the narrative. Talk about the future, not the past. Talk about the hopes, not the fears. Talk about what a human being is able to do in a positive way, and not about the stupidities we are able to do and everybody knows very well. So, rebuild, refresh, restart, again, our own speech, our own strategy. We can make it if we are smart enough to do it. Thank you very much.
That's a bit of a hard act to follow. That was really wonderful, Mr. President. Thank you so much. And you can call me Mr. President, too, because I'm the president of IETA, which is a business group. But I want to tell you just a little bit about what our connection is, because I actually was reflecting on many of the same things about exploration. But for me, I was thinking about Maurice Strong as an explorer, and Maurice Strong as a pioneer and as a visionary. I want to tell you, like IETA, I don't know how many of you have heard of us, International Emissions Trading Association, is this little business group that believes in carbon caps. We believe in declining carbon caps, and we believe in net zero emissions. And we have 130 companies that are devoted to that and work on it every day all around the world. We've spent today, and we will spend tomorrow in this room talking about how to do that. But the goals are clear, and we don't dispute what the goals are. But what you might not know is that IETA is an organization that was a Maurice Strong idea. It grew out of an UNCTAD project back in the 1990s. I was at the Department of Energy when it started in the United States. By the time it actually reached its fever pitch, we were approaching I think it was COP4, so after Kyoto, but COP4 in Buenos Aires. And we were talking about whether a business association should spin out of this UNCTAD project. This UNCTAD project had involved dialogues with Richard Sandor at the Chicago Board of Trade, and with Maurice, and with Nobel laureate economist Ronald Coase, that actually attracted a lot of interest from negotiators on climate change. Not necessarily because it was because it was going to create a new business, but because it was a way to achieve their carbon reduction goals cheaper. So I attended those meetings as a White House official in the Clinton administration. So we got to Buenos Aires. It was a big meeting about whether IETA was actually going to be spun out of UNCTAD and whether it was going to become a thing or not. And I was asked to come to this meeting by Frank Joshua, who had sort of spearheaded this program. And I sat next to Maurice. And so Maurice said good things about it. He elbowed me, and I said good things about it, that the United States would welcome this. And lo and behold, this organization spun out. 20 years later, we are hosting events still in the Explorers Club about how to achieve greater ambition. And at least two of our former chairmen are here in the room. David Hone from Shell and Jack Kogan from NatSource, and there might be others back there, but some of IETA members are in this room because we really honor what Maurice stood for and what he brought about. So I want to just tell you just a snippet about what happened in this room today, because it turns out that it's not just a story about the past. There is some important past in this room. So this flag behind me, this flag flew on Kon-Tiki. Remember the Kon-Tiki boat? This flew on Kon-Tiki, but it also was taken by explorers all around the world in different things. Behind this screen is a flag that went to the moon. So the explorers, if you make it up the stairs to the top floor, include astronauts. And this, there is a note here that you can come and read at the end of the dinner. But a note here, by the way, I knew none of this until like 8 hours ago. Okay, I'm now an expert, right? But there's a letter here from an astronaut, James Lowell, who was on Apollo 13, who apologized because he didn't. He was not able to fly the flag on the moon because he had a technical problem he was trying to solve, like to live, right? So each of these flags has these memories around it about explorers and achievements and about human endeavor. And for us, it came across as a really inspiring thing. So I'm going to tell you 3 very quick things, and then I'm going to sit down and let you have dinner. The last explorer that spoke to us, and this really spoke to me when I heard the introduction, he's been working with the Inuit to understand the narwhal. Do you know the narwhal? Oh, is he here? Where? Here. Of course. My husband. Your husband. Where? This man, stand up. One of our explorers, and he inspired us all talking about working with the Inuit to understand the narwhal, which is the unicorn, can I say this? The unicorn of the whale industry. But fascinating, and that's part of what this is about. This is about new discovery, new learnings, and new discoveries. And you should really get a chance to say hello to Martin later. The second thing earlier in the day was Robert Swan, Sir Robert Swan, who's the first person who has walked to both poles. And he talked to us about what that human endeavor was like. But you know what he's about now? He's all about renewable energy and about climate achievement, because his goal is to make sure that we actually maintain polar ice caps and that there is still free lands to explore there. And our first explorer of the day was Bertrand Piccard, who's of course the man who is very future-oriented, who flew around the world on a solar airplane. So exploring, we're not done with it, I guess is the point. And I think Maurice would appreciate that yes, it is something. And I think President Calderon, that's what you were talking about, is we have to have that same inspiration to take us forward. So that's certainly what's been talked about in this room today. And it really is, I think, a testament to Maurice's legacy that those ideas are alive and well and moving forward. And now they're talking about not just reducing emissions by 20% by this date or stabilization by that date. It's talking about net zero as soon as we can get there. Thank you.
Good evening, Hannah, Minister, friends. You've gathered here tonight to remember Morris and to celebrate the success of the strong universal network. Allow me to start by saying how much I wish I was there with you. The influence that Morris had on my life is immeasurable. Whether it's the reason I got into business or my perspective on public policy as it applies to the environment, to the developing world, or to Indigenous Canada. I knew what was important in large part because of Morris's guidance, his friendship, his leadership, and the opportunities he gave me early on. At Morris's invitation, I was an observer at the Rio conference in 1992. And I will never forget the conversation I had with him a month or two later, when he talked about the influence that Rio would have on other conferences that would follow, and of his insight as to how uphill a battle it would be. The ramifications of Rio were a bit of a disappointment to Morris, but he knew it was a continuation and the start of something major. He was a citizen of the world, and he represented the world even when most couldn't see what it needed or where it was going. A bit like today. Let me stop here just to note that I would not have wanted to be within 100 miles of Morris when the United States withdrew from the Paris Accord. But Morris was always an optimist, and I believe that he would see that despite its ups and downs, there are a billion people like all of you fighting the fight that has to be fought. I know Morris would be proud of the work being done today by all of you in this room. It takes good people and great motivation to make things happen. And from all I've read about the strong universal network, you are a force to be reckoned with, much like Morris was. Again, I wish I was with you tonight. Hannah, we love Morris, and we love you. At this time, all of us are thinking of nothing else but the both of you. Thank you, and good night.
My dear friends, I'm extremely sorry that I cannot be at the dinner to pay my own personal tribute to Maurice. I have always thought him to be a unique character in the world. From his beginnings in a very humble way, he has generated his own enthusiasm for different types of work, all geared towards improving the environment of the world. I have been deeply impressed by what he has done, and I am deeply impressed by the many projects and people who are interested in this that are being followed up, as I'm sure you're doing tonight. I want to add that when I was president of the World Bank, I turned to Morris to have his insight into the work I was doing there. His ideas were always appropriate and on point, and I missed him very much after I left the bank and no longer had the opportunity to do the things that I could earlier do. I'm very hopeful that with this new initiative, there'll be a recreation of the enthusiasm that he gave himself to all his friends and to the community. And I look forward to being part of that initiative and helping in whatever way I can. Again, I say I'm sorry that I'm not with you tonight, but I'll get better soon, and then I will probably make myself not very suitable to attend the gatherings because I will want to say too much about Maurice. Thank you for this opportunity to dictate this short note about a truly great friend.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues,
I regret that I'm unable to join you this evening as I'm hosting the United Nations Development Programme's Equator Prize Award ceremony and therefore could not be with you. However, it is a pleasure to be able to be part of this touching event which has drawn together so many of Maurice Strong's friends, a real testament to how much he was respected and loved by a very global community. Maurice was a friend and mentor to many of us. He was also a true leader and trailblazer for the environment. Indeed, Maurice's work gave birth to a brand new era of international environmental diplomacy and governance at the 1972 Stockholm Conference, which saw the birth of the United Nations Environment Programme. It was the first UN agency to be headquartered in a developing country, and it was Maurice who built up UNEP from the ground with its headquarters in Nairobi on what was then a very simple coffee farm on the outskirts of the capital city of Kenya. Maurice convened the first ever international expert group meeting on climate change, a clear demonstration of how he was way ahead of the curve. He shepherded in a range of vital global environmental governance processes from the original Rio Earth Summit, Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration to the launch of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Crucially, Maurice ensured the full participation of developing countries in these processes that included listening closely to those who were feeling marginalized, as well as indigenous people and those who were the poor in the world. He was also a champion of nature-based solutions. He always saw the human species as part of the greater natural whole. He always identified the incredible capacity of nature to provide answers that even the most sophisticated technology and science still cannot match to this day. It is a wonderful testimony to Maurice Strong that this event has been arranged to coincide with the UN General Assembly and the Climate Action Summit of the UN Secretary General. At the 2014 UN General Assembly, Maurice Strong called on world leaders to rise to their historic responsibility as custodians of the planet, and I quote, to take decisions that will unite rich and poor, north, south, east and west in a new global partnership to ensure our common future. The international community is honoring that vision by taking decisive climate action here in New York, we hope. It is also very welcome to see that leaders of the travel and tourism industry are getting behind the SunX initiative and are committing to climate-friendly travel, helping us to meet our climate goals. This is a step that I believe Maurice Strong would have welcomed. Maurice will be forever remembered for placing the environment on top of the international agenda at the heart of development, with people and the planet being an integral part of that agenda. His courage, his entrepreneurship, his brilliance will continue to inspire me personally, and I know many generations to come. It is on his legacy that many of us are building today with the hope that we can address the great challenges of the 21st century with the pioneering work that he was so much part of. To all of you and to all of us, thank you for being part of this continuing effort, and I wish you a very successful evening here in New York. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. We're just going to move on to the next section. So I hope that you're enjoying the meal so far. And what I'd like to do is just share a couple of stories about Maurice that I have experienced, and then I have a couple of people to introduce. I had the pleasure of working with Maurice on the book Only One Earth, and one of the very nice aspects of that was the book took you from the 1960s through to the preparations for Rio Plus 20. And so it's got some very nice stories. Of course, we would recommend you buy many copies. One of them from the Stockholm conference, which I remember, was the issue about China. It was China's first UN conference that they attended after having joined the United Nations. And there was a particular point in the conference where they still hadn't got the final okay to support the Stockholm Declaration that was being agreed. And Maurice was worried that they would have to either vote against or abstain. And he did manage to find a relatively unique solution to that, which was, as those people who attend UN conferences know, you have people sitting at the microphones, and then you have chairs that are for their assistance behind. And he persuaded the Chinese delegation not to leave, not to vote against, but just to move to the back seats so that in fact they were in the room and therefore could be recorded that they had supported in some way the Stockholm outcome. Another very interesting thing from my perspective in my involvement with stakeholders was the, in a sense, unique development of the Agenda 21 document. I still think it's one of the most impressive documents that has been produced because each chapter, each section tells you a story. It tells you a story about what the aims of whatever chapter, whether it's human settlement or whether it's biodiversity. It then tells you what your policy options are, and then it tells you what your means of implementation are. So as a document, it's actually a much better document than the SDG agreement because it's more unique. But there were these 9 chapters in Agenda 21 that at the time perhaps we did not realize how important they were going to be. And those were the chapters about the roles of stakeholders. We take it as granted now that stakeholders should be involved with the decision making and should then engage in delivering that. That wasn't the case in 1992. Mostly it was orientated around the belief that governments would be the mechanism to deal with that. Well, the ability of Morris and Chip Linder at the time in recognizing the role that stakeholders could play, I think has played a critical role in ensuring that for the Sustainable Development Goals, we're all committed, all stakeholders, to doing that and giving unique roles for women, for youth, for indigenous peoples. Those were really critical things and perhaps was not realized at the time, but I think shows, for example, in the climate discussion in the United States, where the United States government is unable to do things. It is industry and it is local and subnational government that have come up and are actually trying to deliver the agreements from Paris. So I think those were 2 very important stories that are in the book that we contributed to for the Rio+20 process. So I have the pleasure of introducing 2 people who are going to come up and also share their experiences. And my first one is Elizabeth Dowswell, or should I say her honor, the Honorable Elizabeth Dowswell, who I had the pleasure of inviting to the first conference of the organization I ran, Stakeholder Forum, in 1993, and who, as many of you already know, is was the executive director of UNEP from 1993 to 97. Elizabeth, could I ask you to come up and make some comments?
Thank you, Felix, Hannah, distinguished guests. You know, I can't remember when I first met Morris Strong, but I do know that from the moment I started to work in the environmental domain, he seemed to be ever present, if not in person, then certainly in spirit. And although you've heard from many people tonight, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share just 3 reflections about the man I came to know. And I'm particularly grateful to speak as a fellow Canadian. The first reflection is one that many of you have commented on, and it is that in retrospect, his influence on both Canadian and international institutions, policies, programs, and actually ways of thinking has been formidable. Often controversial, but always creative. This man of vision, of persistence, of remarkable energy, and the most extensive network made the seemingly impossible possible. Many of you in this room will have been on the receiving end of his persuasive phone calls over time. So perhaps the most seminal moment was indeed the Earth Summit in 1992. Rio was all about embracing the concept of sustainable development, and Maurice asked us to imagine a very different world. He suggested that by bringing together environmental, economic, and social considerations, we would have much improved decision and a much better quality of life for a greater proportion of the Earth's people. At the time, it was a perceptible shift of the world's consciousness. We take it for granted today. And for several decades now, that legacy has actually driven the world community through regular policy conferences, such as the one we're at this week. But everything has been re-examined anew in the context of an integrated sustainability agenda. We certainly have discovered how messy and difficult integration is, and the expectations of many have not yet been met, and targets remain elusive. But there has been stumbling progress, as we're witnessing this week on the sustainability agenda. On every occasion, Maurice was there to bear witness on behalf of the environment, an equitable world, and a positive reaffirmation of multilateralism. It's really not at all surprising that when his death in late November 2015 coincided almost to the week with the Paris meeting on climate change, his admonition and cry for action was recalled by many. My second reflection, again, has been spoken about, and that's the creation of UNEP. But I remember that the Earth Summit was indeed prologue to the future for this very young organization. It was really a turning point because UNEP, which was an environmental organization, had to think about shifting with the powerful forces of globalization and harnessing the powers of interdependence. It needed an organization that would have the capacity to integrate matters of inclusive economic prosperity, social equity, and so it was that the organization started to talk about aid, trade, and debt. Maurice's care and nurturing of the organization that he had designed just never ceased. Upon asking, I was the recipient of stories of the early days and always his wise comment and advice about the thorny issue of global environmental governance. Reflecting on that topic at a forum in Switzerland in 2009, all of the present and former executive directors of UNEP recounted with him a great deal of frustration about the innumerable meetings, the piles of analytical documents, and the powerful speeches that had over the years made the case that there needed to be a reinvention of the world's environmental governance structure if we were going to respond appropriately to symptoms of a world in very wobbly disequilibrium. Maurice reinforced the role of UNEP as the anchor of our global environmental actions, but he envisioned a strengthened, a more resilient UNEP that was respected and authoritative, that demonstrated competence and achieved real results. His view was that while there was indeed fragmentation, proliferation of institutional arrangements, and lack of policy coherence in the global system, and while structural change might indeed be desirable, if the world was not ready, and if member states could not agree on common purpose, then it wouldn't automatically provide the answer. UNEP couldn't be all things to all people. It was part of a multi-layered system that should be mutually reinforcing. And so he very thoughtfully reminded many of us that changing the name, changing the location, changing the architecture of the governance regime was not an end in itself, but rather the means to an end of accountability and results, and would take a good deal of time to accomplish. But for me, it's the third reflection that now seems to be of greatest significance. Although he never said so explicitly, I was never in any doubt that his vision for our world rested upon a broad ethical and spiritual framework of justice, solidarity, respect, and a balancing of power relationships. We saw the moral and ethical principles are being articulated clearly in the Earth Charter. Maurice was convinced that our common humanity was so much more important than our differences, and that we could, in fact, in the end, share a similar worldview. One dimension of Maurice's vision for humanity was indeed shaped by Indigenous peoples. And if you've read his story, Where on the Earth Are We Going?, you'll find glimpses of that profound influence on his life. In Canada, we are currently engaged in a genuine dialogue about commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. For us, forging a renewed partnership is requiring significant soul searching, deep reflection, and collective courage. But there really is no more important conversations than how we will live together sustainably and equitably, how we can reimagine a country that is true to its values and strong in its diversity. Maurice would have made such a contribution to our national journey. In fact, I suspect that his Indigenous friends would have called him a man for all seasons. This world needs thinking, caring, ethical human beings who have a sense of responsibility for those with whom they live and the environment in which they live, and never more so than in a time when we face the existential threat of climate change. In Maurice, the world had such a public servant. He was never a mere observer of life passing by, but rather a living example that one person can indeed make a difference. Thank you, Maurice Strong.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It did throw up a couple of thoughts or memories that I had. The event in 2009, which I also was able to share, was around the IUCN celebration of his birthday. And what people may not realize was there was a serious conversation going on in the corridors on whether Maurice should be the Secretary General of what would become Rio Plus 20. And unfortunately, that perhaps didn't deliver at the end a result that we would have wanted. But it would have been amazing to have him also run that conference, because it clearly wasn't as successful as we had hoped. The second thing was the issue on the fragmentation. There was, I think, because of some of that, a real move under ACAM to try and cluster the conventions. And he managed to succeed to do the chemicals and go some way towards the biodiversity clustering. That is an unfinished business, which needs the new head, Inga, to really focus on, because that vision of a stronger UNEP, which brings back the conventions into some relationship with the body itself, I think is critical. Our second speaker is Michael Mann, who has today recorded what will be the first Maurice Strong Memorial Lecture. So we will have that available shortly, and I'm sure Jeffrey will explain more, and Michael. Michael was introduced to you earlier by Jeffrey, which took the comments that I was going to talk about in the context of the hockey stick. So I just asked Michael if he'd like to come up and make some comments.
Well, thanks. I felt a little bit awkward when I was asked to say some words on Maurice's behalf, because He is one of those individuals that I never actually knew personally, and yet I feel fundamentally touched my life in the work that he did, and his legacy is clearly felt so strongly over these past couple weeks, where this issue of climate change is suddenly getting the level of attention that it deserves. And it is too bad that he's not here to witness that, but his legacy is certainly felt. I wanted to say a few words about that legacy. Again, though I never met him, his contribution to environmental sustainability, I think rightfully sometimes called the father of global sustainable development. I think that is a fair description of his contribution. As was already mentioned here, he did pass away on the eve of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and that agreement constituted a monumental development in the battle to combat climate change that was in many ways a consequence of his efforts. He was the primary force behind the 1992 Rio Earth Summit that really did lay the groundwork for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and subsequent global climate agreements. But we heard this quote of his from the 2014 UN General Assembly that really I find very profound in this moment when he called on world leaders to rise to their historic responsibility as custodians of the planet, to take decisions that will unite rich and poor, north, south, east, and west in a new global partnership to ensure our common future. And I can think of no greater testament to Maurice's legacy than what we have witnessed this past week here in New York City and around the world, with millions of people rising up and demanding that we finally realize this vision. And I think we will. I am optimistic. There were some comments earlier about sort of doom and gloom and negativity and hopelessness, and I do think that this is one of the greatest threats that we face today when it comes to this challenge. In some of the recent polling that's been done here in the US, it was a recent CBS poll, and they looked at people who don't support taking action on climate. And if you look at the crosstabs of that poll, it turns out now nearly as many people don't support action because they think it's too late to do anything, as don't support action because they don't accept the reality of climate change. Now, I think that some of the forces of inaction and denial that I know Maurice faced, and hearing some of his stories, I felt like we were kindred spirits because we probably faced many of those same obstacles and efforts to sort of silence us and intimidate us because of the message that we need to do something, even if it challenges, vested interests. I think that some of those forces of denial and inaction today recognize that they simply can't deny the overwhelming physical evidence that climate change is happening. The impacts of climate change are so profound. We see them playing out in real time. We see the damage, we see the death and destruction. So you can't deny something's happening. So the forces of inaction are looking for other ways to prevent the needed transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. They're looking to drive a wedge within the climate community to divide us on issues like personal responsibility versus collective action and systemic change. They would love nothing more than to see us arguing with each other about cheeseburgers and plastic straws and whether we should fly, during the vacation to see our relatives. They're looking for ways to divide the movement, and one of those ways is doom and gloom and convincing us that there's nothing we can do. Because if you truly believe that there is no agency in the actions that we are taking, it leads you down the same path of inaction as outright denial of climate change. And They don't care what gets you on that path of inaction, they just want you on that path of inaction. So I feel, from what I know and have heard the stories about Maurice, that I think he would have very much recognized that that is a threat, and that we do need hope and optimism, and not false hope, not Pollyannish optimism, but a recognition, and the science supports this, that there is still time to act to prevent the worst from happening. So I feel like all of that is now coming to a head here in New York over the last 2 weeks. I think we will look back at this moment as having been a tipping point. Not the climate tipping points that we fear, but a tipping point in the public consciousness when it comes to the need to act on this existential crisis. And I can't help but imagine that Maurice is looking down with some pride that his vision may now be realized. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Michael, for that. And I think, we're not here just to celebrate the life of Maurice, but to be optimistic about the future and where we're going, and to be partly that family that takes forward his vision in his homes. Jeffrey, I think you're due to take up the next bit.
Wow.
The next section that we're going to cover is something that we haven't touched on at all tonight. But Hannah, you will think about this. We have a couple of messages from friends in China. Maurice had always an enormous interest in China and a belief that China would be one of the drivers of a more sustainable future. He spent a lot of his later days in life in China, and I had the privilege of spending time with him and learning about his belief that China would eventually become perhaps the most dominant player when it came to leading the world into a new sustainability dimension. So I think we have a video here from Jingfen Zhu, who is the Executive Director of the China Biodiversity and Conservation and Green Development Foundation, another institutional piece that Maurice managed to put in places during his lifetime.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, this is Jinfeng Zhou from China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation. I'm honored to speak here, although I cannot to attend the meeting, and my heart is with you. Maurice Strong is our close friend and mentor. In his last 20 years, we have worked very closely. Under his guidance, we built a great achievements in China. I would like to share some of our activities. First, we have over 100 conservation area in China. We call it CICFA, China Conservation Area for Species at locations. And within that system, we covered from the very north to the very south, from the very east to the very west of China. And we have conservation area for birds, for sea lives, even for dark sky. And we have all that, over 100 community protected conservation areas are very great destination for ecotourism. That's the first one. The second is we have a network internationally network with college students. Only in China, we have this year one competition. We have over 1.9 million college students participate in our third nationwide environmental competition. And we have, with that platform, and we connected, work together with college students and college students NGOs worldwide, and provide support, provide channel, platform. And we have many events almost every month in China. And the third part we would like to mention, we have in China, we have the public fundraising permit. Every year we have hundreds of thousands individuals donate to support environmental and sustainable development. With that fund, every year we support over hundreds of grassroots NGOs to implement the ideas. Strong Universal Network is a platform our old friends of Morris Strong get together would like to use this platform to build this platform for the youth in the world. As what we have done in China, we want to use some acts to support youth, to implement, to practice your will, your efforts, your practice in environmental and sustainable development. And we want, with this platform, we want to work with people like you to support youth to build a better world for the future, not only for our generation, for your generation, and for future generations. And starting today, I'm here in China, and I may be there in New York, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America. We want to work together with you to follow Morris Strong's guidance. Let's work together to make the world a better one for us, for all lives in the planet. Thank you.
Good evening and greetings from Kunming, China. On this magnificent evening, we are gathered together thanks to the government and people of Malta. From the farthest corners of the world, we have gathered together to share our commitment to help make the world an even better place for all. It is Morris Strong, his care, and his spirit, all he has shared with us, that brings us together and empowers each of us to add ever more value. If you permit, I shall take only a few moments from your wonderful evening to share my very personal views of Morris and all he has shared with me, which not only created a lasting friendship, but in fact changed my life. If I had to single out a characteristic of Morris, it would be, and I would underline the word respect. Respect for nature, respect for humanity, respect for each and every human being. This respect underlined each position he took, each decision he made, each action and undertaking that he initiated and supported. Morris was a person of vision, and as each of us knows, a person with his feet firmly planted in reality. His vision of what must be was not hampered by others who were limited by what could be, but rather tempered by a profound insight and understanding of how things could be achieved, and the faith in knowing that things could actually be done. As you know, Morris was not so much a person of power, but rather a supreme empowerer, with an innate and well-tested understanding of the capabilities required to achieve what others firmly thought as impossible. To help in this, Morris also had a powerful understanding of and ability to design and forge collaborations. Collaborations, time and time again, were thought to be unconventional, improbable, unimaginable, but experience showed were powerful enough to turn dreams into realities. Empowerment demands trust, and Morris often reminded us, trust but verify. And this was not so much to control, but to seek out every possible improvement. Morris was an opportunist in that he not only saw possibilities where others did not even see the issue, or were deterred by what they perceived as unsurmountable barriers. Finally, Morris was a person of gratitude. Gratitude deeply felt and always sincerely, beautifully, and clearly expressed. Ladies and gentlemen, my thanks to Morris. My thanks to Jeffrey, and our thanks to all of you for being with us this evening.
I want to talk just a minute about education. It's really clear that everything that is done in the great halls of the United Nations has to eventually come through to the next generation. And one of the things that we're trying to do is trying to find ways to build a different sort of movement than the movement that we're seeing at the moment from protesters and people who are legitimately, particularly young people, legitimately banging on the desk and saying, you're not doing the right things. I think we also have to try to influence the next generation if we believe that a changed travel and tourism sector, and I listened to many people tonight saying quite positive things about travel and tourism, it has to get on board and be in the leadership of the rest of industrial society in shifting to a climate neutral 2050 and actually in hitting some of those main issues, particularly around transport emissions. And we're kind of committed to trying to help them see the light. I want to just present a couple of things that we're doing with young people.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
Our environmental behavior today will have a direct impact on the world of tomorrow. Dodo's extinction is totally related to the misbehavior of man. Dodo returns to Earth as a witness of man's misbehavior, as an environmental ambassador to the new generations. A very engaging personality carried by an outstanding graphic illustration.
In SunX, we're developing programs to bring the travel and tourism industry and travelers themselves into the climate response framework to ensure that by 2050, travel and tourism is climate friendly. We call it climate friendly travel. And Dodo is a champion of climate friendly travel. Dodo, in a series of 60 animated cartoons, will show young kids from the ages of 3 to 10 the realities of climate change, the floods, the desertification, the hurricanes, the terrible, terrible tragedies that are occurring, the migration and the death, but it will do it in a way which is lighter and which helps them to understand that they are a part of this, and that as they grow, they have to be responsible, as we all have to be responsible.
Some days are good.
Environmental awareness is one of the major challenges for the future of our planet.
Even Mondays.
So, we have decided to create an annual award to someone who is making a great contribution to the education of the next generation. And to be honest with you, I can think of no one who is more deserving of that award than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is not only a voice of reason in a seemingly totally unreasonable world, but has made a big emphasis of the work that she does in the community with children, with these kids of 3 to 10. This dodo I actually took in 1997 to the UNEP Executive Council. The WTTC had been invited to make a presentation, and I thought it might be a bit more interesting if we could do something that was a bit more lively. So when they asked me to speak, I put this dodo in the seat, and I don't think Klaus Topfer was too happy about this at the time. But it's our intention to give this to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and to start to use these 65 cartoons to get across this message to the next generation. And whilst I mention that, I also want to say just a couple of things about another initiative that we're trying to do, which is to put in place over the next 10 years 100,000 strong climate champions. We've developed a university education course for students dealing with travel and tourism, and it focuses on climate-friendly travel. And we're trying to encourage people from Gloria's organization, from the WTTC members, to sponsor young people to become involved in this thinking and to be a different kind of movement that would help, on the one hand, to move the industry into what we believe is the right direction, and in the other hand, to help us to convince the public that actually climate-friendly travel, measured, green, and 2050 proof, plugged into the evolving, hardening Paris Agreement, can actually play a positive role in the future of humanity. I want to particularly say that our friend Jingfen Chu in China is going to bring this movement to China and the One Belt and One Road countries, that Ingle International, a Canadian company, and I think, Gina, you are here tonight, is going to help us bring this to Canada, and that Exo Travel will be sponsoring young people in Indonesia and Cambodia. And it's a long-term movement. It's 10 years. And we think in 10 years we can build a generation which is making a positive contribution.
You know, Morris has been a mentor for me and for scores of people who are now deeply engaged in the sustainability debate. But more than that, the fact that there is a sustainability debate and that it's on the world stage is largely a product of Morris's efforts over the course of 40 years. He has been an advocate for getting things done rather than talking about them, and this is a moment we need to do that.
Morris's work is an inspiration, as it is for all of us. But I think we need to carry his inspiration forward.
At a very personal level, Morris has been like an elder brother to me. Our relationship is like that, of total trust. At a professional level, he is, of course, been the person who has reminded the world of its responsibilities to the future, a point that he repeats again and again, saying, don't get caught in details. Remember that in the final analysis, this is a moral and an ethical issue. And I think this is his most important message for people who are involved in this business. Do not lose sight of the fundamental responsibility we have to our children, our grandchildren, and the people who are to come.
The world, more than any time, needs to be reminded of the work and the vision of Maurice Strong. And this all started to a large degree in 1992 in the Rio Conference with the Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was a Rio Convention. Morris's contribution cannot be minimized and was instrumental in this happening. So the world owes a debt of gratitude to the work and the vision that Morris had.
This conference is not only going to change the course, the direction of our life on this planet, but it's going to change the way in which we consult with each other about the fundamental decisions that shape our direction on this planet. This global forum has played an absolutely indispensable part in that process, because the interaction between people and their governments here at the forum and at the Rio Center has also had its counterpart in the reporting by the media to the vast millions of people out there who you and they in different ways represent. This is the first truly global conference in the sense that literally hundreds of millions of people are out there with us here.
I'm only a child, yet I know we are all part of a family, 5 billion strong. In fact, 30 million species strong. And borders and governments will never change that. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal.
20 years has passed. The world is experiencing a crisis in our ecological systems. We need more than just promises and declarations. We need action.
As the president of the World Travel and Tourism Council, I went to the Rio Earth Summit. I had that capacity. I met the chairman of the Secretary General of the summit, Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong had been the father of sustainable development, and he had been involved for 40 years in building up this from the Club of Rome, right through the Brundtland Commission, to the creation of the United Nations Environment Programme, to this big summit, with the biggest summit that had ever been held, to ask the question, what are we doing about the planet? And SunX is a legacy to Maurice Strong. It's the Strong Universal Network, and we added the X at a certain stage because climate change is existential.
The natural world in which man lives and on which he depends is indeed deteriorating, is being destroyed in many instances at a rate that is accelerating, and that can only continue to accelerate unless we begin to control the activities that are having this destructive impact. Now, whether we are pessimistic or optimistic depends really on what we think about the nature of man. Whether we really believe that man, in light of this evidence, is going to be wise enough and enlightened enough to subject himself to this kind of discipline and control.
Man has sobered up somewhat, and the environment issue has made him realize that he does have to make very hard choices. He hasn't got it made. He can't have it all. always. He's got to decide, and in deciding, it's the deeper sense of values which is finally going to determine what he decides.
It was not as much optimism as excitement and expectation and hope. Hope that this World Conference, which attracted more world leaders than had ever assembled before, would in fact be able to move us off the dime onto a pathway to a more sustainable future, to help make a fundamental change of course in industrial civilization.
The environment crisis, perhaps most of all, makes it clear that man can no longer avoid the necessity of choice, because the choices we make are really going to determine the future course of human evolution on this planet. And while nobody can put a date by which we will have reached the point of no return, it seems very clear to me from all the evidence I've seen from the scientific world that the choices we make in this generation will really determine whether we make it or not. We've got the basis for change now, but we've got to push like hell to make sure it takes place.
The scientists clearly have reached a consensus that it is in fact human activity, our activity, that is causing this crisis, which is a crisis of survival. We have to change our behavior, and we have to change the system within which that behavior has its impact. As long as there is a chance that we can succeed, and we have to think there still is, that chance is diminishing day by day. Every day that we fail to move in the right direction is a step towards disaster and makes it much more likely to happen, much more difficult to stop. Young people have tremendous political influence if they know how to exercise it. And it is ultimately at the political level that the action process must be led. Movements like this that engage the excitement of young people, that engage their attention and provide channels for their commitment to a better world, a better planet. And that's the kind of thing that inspires them. Now, not just dry UN resolutions, however, even dry UN resolutions can be put into much more exciting terms when you translate them into human terms. It takes knowledge of why it is that this UN is so important to their future. What does it mean? It's not just an abstract organization way out there. What does it mean to them? What happens if there weren't a UN? But it means that young people need to understand their role and understand why that role can be changed and must be changed, and they can exercise tremendous influence. We can't avoid change. It's imminent. It's already happening in some cases. But by 2020, I'd like to be in a position of saying, well, we've avoided the worst. We haven't done it all, but we're on track. We've made the fundamental changes in the way we conduct our affairs, our private lives, our governments, our relationships with each other and with the earth. And we're now on the track where we can envisage a sustainable and secure future.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. On the way out, we've put together a bag for everybody which has a copy of a book called Remembering Maurice F. Strong, which was put together by some friends of his. It's a series of essays, a little bit like what you've seen tonight. There's a copy of the report that we produced for WTTC on climate-friendly travel, and there's a copy of the Earth Charter. We want to institutionalize this process, just as Maurice institutionalized processes, and we look forward to having a similar evening to this during the assembly next year. Thank you so much for being with us.